Hi, we're going to read Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. Yesterday I read the first half of chapter 7, so we're going to read the rest of it today. We'll start on the top of page 153. Books! Cried Little Man on Christmas morning. For Stacy there was the Count of Monte Cristo, for me the Three Musketeers, and for Christopher John and Little Man 2 different volumes of Aesop's Fables. On the inside cover of each book in Mamma's fine hand was written the name of the owner. Mine read, "This book is the property of Miss Cassie Deborah Logan, Christmas 1933." "Man sold me them books told me these 2 was written by a black man," Papa said, opening my book and pointing to a picture of a man in a long fancy coat and a wigful of curly hair that fell to his shoulders. "Name of Alexander Dumas, a French fellow. His daddy was a mulatto, and his grandmamma was a slave down on one of them islands. Martinique, it says here. Man said to me they write hard reading for children, but I told him he didn't know my babies. They can't read 'em now, I said. They'll grow into 'em." In addition to the books, there was a sock full of once-a-year store-bought licorice, oranges, and bananas for each of us, and from Uncle Hammer a dress and a sweater for me, and a sweater and a pair of pants each for Christopher John and Little Man. But nothing compared to the books. Little Man, who treasured clothes above all else, carefully laid his new pants and sweater aside and dashed for a clean sheet of brown paper to make a cover for his book. And throughout the day, as he lay upon the deerskin rug, looking at the bright, shining pictures of far-away places, turning each page as if it were gold, he would suddenly squint down at his hands, glance at the page he had just turned, then dash into the kitchen to wash again, just to make sure. After the church services, the Averys returned home with us for Christmas dinner. All 8 of the Avery children, including the 4 preschoolers, crowded into the kitchen with the boys and me, smelling the delicious aromas and awaiting the call to eat. But only the eldest girls, who were helping Mamma, Big Ma, and Mrs. Avery prepare the finishing touches to the meal, were allowed to remain. The rest of us were continuously being shooed out by Big Ma. Finally, the announcement we were all waiting for was made, and we were allowed to begin the Christmas feast. The meal lasted for over 2 hours through firsts, seconds, and thirds, talk and laughter, and finally dessert. When we were finished, the boys and I, with Claude and TJ, went outside. But the half-inch layer of snow made everything sloppy, so we soon went back in and joined the adults by the fire. Shortly afterward, there was a timid knock on the front door. Stacy opened the door and found Jeremy Sims standing there looking frozen and very frightened as he peered into the bright room. Everyone turned to stare at him. Stacy glanced around at Papa, then back at Jeremy. You want to come in?" he asked awkwardly. Jeremy nodded and stepped hesitantly inside. As Stacy motioned him toward the fire, Uncle Hammer's eyes narrowed and said to Papa, "He looks like a Sims." "I believe he is," Papa agreed. "Then what the devil—" "Let me handle it," Papa said. Jeremy, who had heard, flushed a deep red and quickly handed Mama a small burlap bag. I brung them for y'all." Mama took the bag. As she opened it, I peeped over her shoulder. The bag was full of nuts. "Nuts?" I questioned. "Nuts! Why we got more nuts now than we know what—" "Cassie," Mama scowled, "what have I told you about that mouth of yours?" Then she turned to Jeremy. "This is very thoughtful of you, Jeremy, and we appreciate them. Thank you." Jeremy nodded slightly as if he did not know how to accept her thanks, and stiffly handed a slender paper-wrapped object to Stacy. "Made this for ya," he said. Stacy looked at Pa to see if he should take it. For a long moment Papa studied Jeremy, then he nodded. "It ain't much," stammered Jeremy as Stacy tore off the wrapping. "Made it myself." Stacy slid his fingers down the smooth, sanded back of a wooden flute. "Go ahead and try it," said a pleased Jeremy. "It blows real nice." Again Stacy looked at Papa, but this time Papa gave him no indication what he should do. "Thanks, Jeremy. It's real fine," he said. Then Flute in hand, he stood uncomfortably by the door waiting for Jeremy to leave. When Jeremy did not move, Papa asked, "You Charlie Sim's boy?" Jeremy nodded. "Yes, sir." "Your daddy know where you're here?" Jeremy bit his lower lip and looked at his feet. "No, sir, I reckon not." "Then I expect you better be getting on home, son, 'fore he come looking for you." "Yes, sir," said Jeremy, backing away. As he reached the door, I cried after him, "Merry Christmas, Jeremy!" Jeremy looked back and smiled shyly. "Merry Christmas to you all, too." TJ made no comment on Jeremy's visit until both Papa and Uncle Hammer had left the room. He was afraid of Papa and downright terrified of Uncle Hammer, so he never had much to say when either was around. But now that they had gone outside, "Mr. Avery," he said, "you ain't going to keep that thing, are you?" Stacy looked malevolently at TJ, and I knew that he was thinking of the coat. "Yeah, I'm going to keep it. Why?" TJ shrugged. "Nothin', 'ceptin' I sure wouldn't want no whistle some old white boy been blowin' on." I watched Stacy closely to see if he was going to allow himself to be goaded by TJ. He was not. "Aw, stuff it, TJ," he ordered. "Aw, man, don't get me wrong," said TJ quickly. "You want to keep the old thing, it's up to you. But for me, somebody give me something. I want it to be something fine, like that pretty little pearl-handled pistol." When the Averys had left, Stacy asked, "Papa, how come Jeremy give me this flute? I mean, I didn't give him none." "Maybe you did give him something," Papa said, lighting his pipe. "No, sir, Papa, I ain't never give him nothing." "Not even your friendship?" "Well, not really. I mean, he's a crazy kid and he likes to walk to school with us, but—" "You like him?" Stacy frowned, thinking. "I told him I didn't want him walking with us, but he keeps on anyway, and the white kids laugh at him 'cause he do. But he don't seem to let it bother him none. I s'pose I like him all right. Is that wrong?" "No," Papa said carefully, "that ain't wrong." "Actually, he's much easier to get along with than TJ," Stacy went on, "and I suppose if I let him, he could be a better friend than TJ." Papa took the pipe from his mouth, rubbed his mustache, and spoke quietly. "Far as I'm concerned, friendship between black and white people don't mean that much 'cause it usually ain't on an equal basis. Right now you and Jeremy might get along fine, but in a few years he'll think of himself as a man, but you'll probably still be a boy to him. And if he feels that way, he'll turn on you in a minute." "But, Papa, I don't think Jeremy'd be that way." Papa's eyes narrowed and his resemblance to Uncle Hammer increased. "We Logans don't have much to do with white folks. You know why? 'Cause white folks mean trouble. You see blacks hanging round with whites, they're headed for trouble. Maybe one day whites and blacks can be real friends, but right now the country ain't built that way. Now you could be right about Jeremy making a much finer friend than TJ ever will be. The trouble is, down here in Mississippi, it costs too much to find out. So I think you'd better not try." Stacy looked full into Papa's face and read his meaning. On my way to bed, I stopped by the boys' room to retrieve an orange Christopher John had swiped from my stocking and spied Stacy fingering the flute. As I stood in the doorway, he lingered over it, then carefully rewrapping it, placed it in his box of treasured things. I never saw the flute again. The day after Christmas, Papa summoned Stacy, Christopher John, Little Man, and me into the barn. We had hoped against hope that Mamma would not tell him about our trip to the Wallace store, or, if she did, that he would not forget what he had promised. We should have known better. Mamma always told Papa everything, and Papa never forgot anything. After we had received our punishment, we emerged sore and teary-eyed and watched Papa, Uncle Hammer, and Mr. Morrison climb into the Packard and speed away. Mamma said they were going to Vicksburg. "Why Vicksburg, Mamma?" asked Stacy. "They've got some business to attend to," she said shortly. "Come on now, get busy. We've got chores to do." In the late afternoon, shortly after the men had returned, Mr. Jameson arrived. He brought with him a fruit cake sent by Mrs. Jameson and a bag of lemon drops for each of the boys and me. Mamma allowed us to say our thanks, then sent us outside. We played for a while in the patches of snow that remained, but when that grew tiresome, I popped into the house to see what was happening. Mamma ordered me to pop back out again. "What are they doing?" asked Little Man. "Looking at a whole bunch of papers," I said, "and Uncle Hammer was signing something." "What kind of papers?" asked Stacy. I shrugged. "I don't know. But Mr. Jameson was saying something about selling the land." "Selling the land?" questioned Stacy. "You sure?" I nodded. "He said, 'Y'all sign them papers, and Miss Caroline got no more legal right to this land. Can't sell it, can't sign on it. It'll be in y'all's name, and it'll take both of y'all to do anything with it.'" "Both of who?" I shrugged again. "Papa and Uncle Hammer, I guess." After a while it grew chilly and we went inside. Mr. Jameson, sitting next to Big Ma, was putting some papers into his briefcase. "I hope you feel better now that that's done, Miss Caroline," he said, his voice a soft mixture of Southern aristocracy and Northern schooling. Miss Caroline's Big Ma. "Hammer and David, they've been taking care of things a long time now," Big Ma said. "Them and Mary works hard to pay the taxes and mortgage on this place here, and I've been wanting to make sure while I'm still breathing that they gets title to this place under the law without no trouble. I ain't wanting a whole lot of problems after I'm gone 'bout who's got rights to this land." She paused a moment, then added, "That happens sometimes, you know." Mr. Jameson nodded. He was a long, thin man in his mid-50s with a perfect lawyer face, so placid that it was difficult to guess what thoughts lay behind it. The boys and I sat down silently in the study table at the silence allowed us to stay. I figured that Mr. Jameson would be leaving now. His business was evidently finished, and despite the fact that the family thought well of him, he was not considered a friend in the usual sense, and there seemed no reason for him to stay longer. But now Mr. Jameson put his briefcase back on the floor, indicating that he was not leaving, and looked first at Big Ma and Mama, then across at Papa and Uncle Hammer. "There's talk that some of the people around here are looking to shop in Vicksburg," he said. Big Ma looked around at Papa and Uncle Hammer, but neither of them acknowledged her glance. Their eyes were pinned on Mr. Jameson. "There's talk, too, why folks are looking to shop there." He paused, met Papa's eyes, then Uncle Hammer's, and went on. "As you know, my family has roots in Vicksburg. We've a number of friends there still. I got a call from one of them this morning. Said you were looking to find credit for about 30 families." Papa and Uncle Hammer neither affirmed nor denied this. "You know as well as I do that credit doesn't come easy these days," continued Mr. Jameson. "You expect to get any, you'll need something to back it." "I reckon we know that," said Uncle Hammer. Mr. Jameson glanced at Uncle Hammer and nodded. "I reckoned you did, but as far as I can see, the only thing any of you got to back that credit with is this land, and I'd hate to see you put it up." "Why's that?" asked Uncle Hammer, wary of his interest. "Because you'd lose it." The fire popped and the room grew silent. Then Papa said, "Well, what are you getting at?" "I'll back the credit." Again silence. Mr. Jameson allowed Papa and Uncle Hammer several moments to search for a motive behind his mask-like face. "I'm a Southerner, born and bred, but that doesn't mean I approve of all that goes on here, and there are a lot of other white people who feel the same." "Well, if you and so many others feel that way," said Uncle Hammer, with a wry sneer, "then how come them Wallaces ain't in jail?" "Hammer," Big Mom started. "Because," answered Mr. Jameson candidly, honestly, "there aren't enough of those same white people who could admit how they feel, or even if they did, would hang a white man for killing a black one. It's as simple as that." Uncle Hammer smiled slightly and shook his head, but his eyes showed a grudging respect for Mr. Jameson. "Backing the loan will be strictly a business matter. In the fall, when the crops are in, those people who've bought the goods in Vicksburg will have to pay for them. If they don't, then I'll have to. Of course, as a businessman, I'm hoping that I won't have to put out a penny. My own cash box isn't exactly overflowing. So there'll have to be a credit limit. Still, it would lend me a great deal of satisfaction to know that I was part of all this." He looked around. "Well, what do you think?" "You know it ain't hardly likely," Papa said, "that after accounts are figured, there'll be any money to pay any debts at all, except those up at that Wallace store." Mr. Jameson nodded knowingly. "But the offer still stands." Papa inhaled deeply. Well, then, I'd say it's up to those people who'd be buying on your signature. They want to do it, then we got no say in it. We always pay cash. You know, if you sign that credit, said Uncle Hammer, you won't be the most popular man down in here. You thought about that? Yes, said Mr. Jameson thoughtfully. My wife and I discussed it fully. We realized what could happen. But I'm just wondering if you do. Besides the fact that a number of white folks around here resent this land you've got and your independent attitude, there's Harlan Granger. Now, I've known Harlan all my life, and he's not going to like this. I wanted to ask what Mr. Granger had to do with anything, but common sense told me that I would only earn eviction by asking. But then Mr. Jameson went on and explained without any prodding from me. Ever since we were boys, Harlan's lived in the past. His grandmother filled him with all kinds of tales about the glory of the South before the war. You know, back then the Grangers had one of the biggest plantations in the state, and Spokane County practically belonged to them. And they thought it did too. They were consulted about everything concerning this area, and they felt it was up to them to see that things worked smoothly, according to the law, a law basically for whites. Well, Harlan feels the same now as his grandmother did back then. He also feels strongly about this land, and he resents the fact that you won't sell it back to him. You back the credit with it now, and he'll seize this opportunity to take it away from you. You can count on it. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had grown so quiet I had to lean forward to hear his next words. And if you continue to encourage people not to shop at the Wallace store, you could still lose it. Don't forget that Harlan leases that store land to the Wallaces and gets a hefty percentage of its revenue. Before he let the Wallaces set up storekeeping, he was only getting his sharecroppers' money. Now he gets a nice bit of the Montiers and Harrison's sharecroppers' money too, since both of those plantations are too small to have a store, and he's not hardly going to stand for your interfering with it. But even more important than all that, you're pointing a finger right at the Wallaces with these boycott business. You're not only accusing them of murder, which in this case would be only a minor consideration because the man killed was black, but you're saying that they should be punished for it, that they should be punished just as if they had killed a white man, and punished of a white man for a wrong done to a black man would denote equality. Now that is what Harlan Granger absolutely will not permit. Mr. Jameson was silent, waiting. No one else spoke, and he went on again. What John Henry Barry and his brother were accused of, making advances to a white woman, goes against the grain of Harlan Granger and most other white folks in this community more than anything else. You know that. Harlan may not believe in the methods of the Wallaces, but he'll definitely support them. Believe me on that. Mr. Jameson picked up his briefcase, ran his fingers through his graying hair, and met Papa's eyes. The sad thing is, you know in the end you can't beat him or the Wallaces. Papa looked down at the boys and me, awaiting his reply, then nodded slightly, as if he agreed. Still, he said, well, I want these children to know we tried, and what we can't do now, maybe one day they will. I do hope that's so, David, murmured Mr. Jameson, going to the door. I truly hope that's so. In the days that followed Mr. Jameson's visit, Papa, Mama, and Uncle Hammer went to the houses of those families who were considering shopping in Vicksburg. On the fourth day, Papa and Uncle Hammer again went to Vicksburg, but this time in the wagon with Mr. Morrison. Their journey took 2 days, and when they returned, the wagon was loaded with store-bought goods. What's all that? I asked Papa as he jumped from the wagon. That for us? No, Cassie girl. It's things folks ordered from Vicksburg. I wanted to ask more questions about the trip, but Papa seemed in a hurry to be off again, and my questions went unanswered until the following day, when Mr. Granger arrived. Christopher John and I were drawing water from the well when the silver Packard glided to a smooth stop in the drive, and Mr. Granger stepped out. He stared sour-faced at Uncle Hammer's Packard in the barn, then opened the gate to the front yard and stepped briskly across the lawn to the house. Hastily, Christopher, John, and I tugged on the well rope, pulled up the water tube, and poured the water into the bucket. Each of us gripping a side of the heavy bucket, we hurried to the back porch where we deposited it, then tiptoed silently through the empty kitchen to the door leading to Mama and Papa's room. Little Man and Stacy, just leaving the room under Mama's orders, allowed the door to remain slightly cracked, and all four of us huddled against it, stepladder fashion. "You sure giving folks something to talk about with that car of yours, Hammer," Mr. Granger said in his folksy dialect as he sat down with a grunt across from Papa. In spite of his college education, he always spoke this way. "What they got you doing up north? Bootlegging whiskey?" He laughed dryly, indicating that the question was to be taken lightly, but his eyes, tight on Uncle Hammer, showed that he intended to have an answer. Uncle Hammer, leaning against the fireplace mantel, did not laugh. "Don't need to bootleg," he said sullenly. "Up there I got me a man's job, and they pay me a man's wages for it." Mr. Granger studied Uncle Hammer. Uncle Hammer wore, as he had every day since he had arrived, sharply creased pants, a vest over a snow-white shirt, and shoes that shone like midnight. "You right cityfied, ain't you? Course you always did think you was too good to work in the fields like other folks." "No, that ain't it," said Uncle Hammer. "I just ain't never figured 50 cents a day was worth a child's time, let alone a man's wages." Uncle Hammer said nothing else. He didn't need to. Everyone knew that 50 cents was the top price paid to any day laborer, man, woman, or child hired to work in the Granger fields. Mr. Granger ran his tongue around his teeth, making his lips protrude in odd half-circles. Then he turned from Uncle Hammer to Papa. "Some folks tell me y'all running a regular traveling store up here. Here tell a fellow can get just about anything he wants from up at Tate's in Vicksburg if he just lets you all know." Papa met Mr. Granger's eyes but did not speak. Mr. Granger shook his head. "Seems to me you folks are just stirring up something. Y'all got roots in this community. Even got yourselves that loan Paul Edward made from the First National Bank up in Strawberry for the eastern 200 acres. Course now, with times like they are, that mortgage could come due any time. And if it comes due and y'all ain't got the money to pay it, y'all could lose this place." "Ain't gonna lose it," said Uncle Hammer flatly. Mr. Granger glanced up at Uncle Hammer, then back to Papa. He took a cigar from his pocket, then a knife to cut off the tip. After he had thrown the tip into the fire, he settled back in his chair and lit the cigar while Papa, Mama, Uncle Hammer, and Big Ma waited for him to get on. Then he said, "This is a fine community. Got fine folks in it, both white and colored. Whatever's bothering you people, you all just tell me. We'll get it straightened out without all this big to-do." Uncle Hammer laughed outright. Mr. Granger looked up sharply, but Uncle Hammer eyed him insolently, a smile still on his lips. Mr. Granger, watching him, cautioned sternly, "I don't like trouble here. This is a quiet and peaceful place. I aim to see it stays that way." Turning back to Papa, he continued, "Whatever problems we have, we can work them out. I ain't gonna hide that I think y'all making a big mistake, both for the community and for yourselves, going all the way down to Vicksburg to do your shopping. That don't seem very neighborly." "Neither does burning," said Uncle Hammer. Mr. Granger puffed deeply on his cigar and did not look at Uncle Hammer. When he spoke again, it was to Big Ma. His voice was harsh, but he made no comment on what Uncle Hammer had said. "I don't think your Paul Edward would have condoned something like this and risked losing this place. How come you let your boys go do it?" Big Ma smoothed the lap of her dress with her hands. "They grown, and it's they land. I got no more say in it." Mr. Granger's eyes showed no surprise, but he pursed his lips again and ran his tongue around his teeth. "The price of cotton's mighty low, y'all know that," he said finally. "Could be that I'll have to charge my people more of their crops next summer, just like to make ends meet. I'd hate to do it, 'cause if I did, my people wouldn't hardly have enough to buy winter stores, let alone be able to pay their debts. He keeps threatening them. There was a tense, waiting silence before his glance slid to Papa again. Mr. Joe Higgins up at First National told me that he couldn't hardly honor a loan to folks who go round stirring up a lot of bad feelings in the community, and especially stirring the colored folks out of their place, interjected Uncle Hammer calmly. Mr. Granger paled, but did not turn to Uncle Hammer. Money's too scarce, he continued as if he had not heard, and folks like that are a poor risk. You ready to lose your land, David, because of this thing? Papa was lighting his pipe. He did not look up until the flame had caught in the tobacco and held there. Then he turned to Mr. Granger. 200 acres of this place been Logan land for almost 50 years now. The other 200 for 15. We've been through bad times and good times, but we ain't never lost none of it. Ain't gonna start now. Mr. Granger said quietly, it was Granger land before it was Logan. Slave land, said Papa. Mr. Granger nodded. Wouldn't have lost this section if it hadn't been stolen by your Yankee carpetbaggers after the war. But y'all keep on playing Santa Claus, and I'm gonna get it back real easy. I want you to know that I plan to do whatever I need to keep peace down in here. So playing Santa Claus, helping people get things at this other store. Papa took the pipe from his mouth and stared into the fire. When he faced Mr. Granger again, his voice was very quiet, very distinct, very short. You being white, you can just about plan on anything you want. But I tell you this one thing. You plan on getting this land, you're planning on the wrong thing. Mama's hand crossed almost unseen to Papa's arm. Mr. Granger looked up slyly. There's lots of ways of stopping you, David. Papa impaled Mr. Granger with an icy stare. Then you'd better make them good, he said. Mr. Granger stood to go, a smile creeping smugly over his lips as if he knew a secret but refused to tell. He glanced at Uncle Hammer, then turned and left, leaving the silence behind him.